right, well, the time is now 7 o'clock, everybody. So I hope everybody's doing well. Again, my name is Laura, and I want to welcome you to yet another one of our popular Date with History lecture series. We're so excited to get started, but before we do, just to give everybody who hasn't logged in yet a chance to log in, we're going to start off as usual by sharing just a few of our upcoming programs. And just your final reminder of, if you'd like to turn off the closed captions, you can do so by using the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen and selecting hide subtitles. But let's learn about what's coming up. So of course, we're going to primarily focus on virtual programs here, but our next virtual program, Virtual Date with History, is going to be Thursday, October 7th, and we're going to be learning a little bit about J.R.R. Tolkien and the World Wars. So we're going to learn about his service during World War X and the service of his sons during World War II. So I'm really excited to share that one with you. So feel free to sign up online as usual to join us for that virtual program. I also am really excited to show off another virtual program that is hosted by our sister museum, the Robert R. McCormick House, part of the museums at Cantini Park. And they're launching a brand new lecture series. Super excited for everybody to join that one. So their new lecture series is called Headlines from History, and it's going to be focusing on historical events that were front page news in the Chicago Tribune. And of course, some of you may know, but this year is the 150th anniversary of the Great Chicago Fire. So that program will be Saturday, October 9th, to commemorate the 150th anniversary of that event, and they're going to dig a little deeper into the Great Chicago Fire and how it made headlines in the Chicago Tribune. Again, you can sign up for that program by visiting cantini.org, and we'll look forward to hosting you there as well. I'm excited to watch that one as a guest, for sure. Another exciting thing happening is, if you enjoy our presentation tonight, we're actually hosting an in-person book signing. I know, our first one in quite some time. So we're going to be hosting a book signing with our author this evening, Ben Milligan, and that's going to be here at Cantini Park on Sunday, September 19th. And if you're wise, you may recognize that that is the same day as the Cantini Car Show. Now, while the car show goes for a longer set of time, Ben will be available between 11:30 a.m. and 12:30 p.m. near the Cantini Park gift shop located in our visitor center. The book is for sale online on cantini.org, or you can pick up a copy at our gift shop. Ben will be here in person to sign copies of his book, and I know that will be very exciting. Now, we primarily focus on virtual programs here, but not to take up too much of your time. There are a lot of events happening in person at the museum for the weekend of September 11th. So I want to encourage everybody to make their way to the events calendar on fdmuseum.org or cantini.org to learn a little bit more about our memorial ceremonies and our post 9/11 Veteran Resources Fair happening the weekend of September 11th. But without further ado, I'm going to take my screen down. Kowalski, it is all you.
Okay, well, thanks a lot, Laura. I appreciate you allowing me to be a part of your program tonight. And Ben, it's great to see you again. And am I coming through, Laura?
Excellent. Yeah, you're coming through great. And Ben, everything looks great.
Okay, yeah, I saw the screen adjust, so I just wanted to make sure. Okay, so what I want to do is actually do a few house cleaning notes up front. So first of all, we will be following our normal Date with History format. We are going to take questions at the last 15 minutes, and how you get your question to Laura is to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the of your computer. You know, don't use the hand raising feature, use the Q&A feature. And as you all know, when you tune in, that Laura will get to as many of those questions as possible. And also, you know, we have been very fortunate not to have any huge technical difficulties. And so we don't intend to have any tonight, but we do have several backup mechanisms in case that happens, to ensure that the program goes to completion. And I think tonight, Laura, we have our Illinois teachers involved in this for professional development. So thanks for our teachers who are tuning in. Ben, so you get to be a professor tonight. There are some teachers tuned in who get credit for listening to this, and also sharing some of your story of the Navy SEALs history with their students. But those of you who are teachers and you are just now hearing about that program, reach out to Laura, and she will give you the information on how to get into that program. So what I want to do now is to actually read a little bit to you. And some of you have seen some of this and know some of this from the different literature that has been out there. And I'll try to share something hopefully that you don't know. But we are very pleased and very fortunate tonight to have Ben Milligan as our speaker. And what he's going to talk about is his book. And so I'll read this. How did the U.S. Navy, the branch of the U.S. military tasked with patrolling the oceans, ever manage to produce a unit of raiders trained to operate on land? And so me as a soldier, I'm very interested in learning more about how that happened. And how, against all odds, did that unit become one of the world's most elite commando forces, routinely striking thousands of miles from the water onto the battlefields of Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and even into Central Africa? Well, we are very fortunate tonight to have an individual who can tell us just that, not only from research and writing this book, but also from experience, because our speaker tonight is former Navy SEAL Benjamin Milligan, and he captures this history and this story like it has never been captured before. And there have been many books written around the Navy SEALs about how they came about, and some recent books in the last 10 to 15 years. But this is the book that is the most definitive, complete history of how the Navy SEALs came about. And as good as I was able to read a part of that, Benjamin, I could tell that you were actually, writing some from your experience, especially when you were talking about the training back in '61 and even in the '50s. And though you didn't go through that training until maybe 40 years later, it was still the same. And you can kind of see that passion coming through. So I'm very pleased to hear some of that. And so I'm kind of going off script here because it talks about how you write this in a thrilling manner and you really capture the moment, and you do. So I don't want to read a lot of what folks have read online. And also when I got to meet Benjamin, and Laura and I talked about this, I could also tell he was a true Navy SEAL, because unlike some bios we get, to include mine sometime, even though we truncate it and it's about 7 or 8 lines, I said, Ben, you only gave us 2 lines in your bio. So, but Ben is, he's still working for our nation. But he became a U.S. Navy SEAL in 2001. He is the recipient of a Bronze Star and other medals. He is a native of Indianapolis, and he currently lives very close to us in the Chicago area. He earned his undergraduate degree in history from Purdue University, and he also earned a master's from the University of San Diego. And so also, Ben, I will tell you, so full disclosure, I've only read 2 books of the chapter. There's a lot of books that come across my desk, and, some I get to skim. I read chapter 2, just out of more curiosity, because, your direct connection with us at Cantini is on D-Day. There were the precursors of the Navy SEAL on some of those LCVPs, LSTs, LCIs that went ashore with the first ID, a part of those men who were doing some of the demolition. So I was given my 3rd presentation in the past 2 years on D-Day. So I went directly to your chapter when Laura gave me the book about a month ago. And then selfishly also, I went to the chapter that talks about how the Navy SEALs was created. So full disclosure, I didn't tell you this. You may not know Ben Goin. You may know who he is, but he was in the first class of Navy SEALs in 1962 on the East Coast, and I got to meet him in 2013, go to his house and collect some artifacts. So I went to that chapter and read it as well. So enough of me talking. I'm going to turn it over to you, Ben, and we are very pleased to have you tonight.
On behalf of our audience that's not here, I'll give you your welcome applause. And Ben, you're free to get going.
Right. First off, thank you very much to Laura and Kowalski. I appreciate that. I actually did talk with Bill Goings in the research of one of my chapters. He's a fascinating guy. He was prevented from learning how to swim in his local pool. Actually, when they integrated the local pool that he would swim at when he was in Ohio, the local owner actually filled it with rocks. He taught himself how to swim in a creek. He's a fascinating guy. But anyway, let me get back to what I was going to say. So thank you, Laura and Kowalski and the First Division Museum at Cantini Park for the opportunity to speak with you all tonight. And second, I'd like to thank you all for your interest in my book, By Water Beneath the Walls, The Rise of the Navy SEALs. This is my first presentation like this, so I hope you'll bear with me if there are any technical problems or if a cat starts banging on the window. And forgive me if this isn't exactly the format that you all are all used to, but having just spent the last 10 years writing a book, that's really all I know how to do anymore. The title that I give in this talk is The Evolution of the Navy SEALs and Why That Matters to the US Army, an evolution that occurred over the roughly 30-year period that stretched from the beginning of World War II to the war in Vietnam. But I'd actually like us to start off by talking about an episode that occurred much more recently. Anyway, here goes. Oops, let me get this to go here. There we go. On August 6, 2011, at 2:39 a.m. local time, pitch black for anyone not wearing night vision goggles, a U.S. Army CH-47 with call sign Extortion 17, its altitude 100 feet above the Logar River, was struck in its aft rotor blades by a Bulgarian-made RPG. The source of the RPG could be traced back to a previously unseen Taliban fighter who had just emerged from the turret of the building in the village of Hassan Kel in the Tangi Valley of eastern Afghanistan. Though he did not know his fate, none of us do, the fighter that pulled the trigger to that rocket might as well have been pulling a noose over his own head, as his act would be avenged by the analysts of the CIA and the 30mm cannon of a US Army Apache gunship in just 62 hours and 46 minutes. The reason for the swiftness of this vengeance was due completely to the luck of that fighter's shot and the blast radius of that shot's explosion in proximity to Extortion 17. In less than a quarter of a second of the RPG's impact, the competing gyroscopic forces of the helicopter's front and rear rotors caused its rear pylon to be ripped free of its fuselage, which in another quarter of a second hurled the entire aircraft into a clockwise spin of 100 plus G-forces that killed all 38 of its occupants almost instantly, and whose remains crashed into the valley floor, where much of the wreckage was consumed in a series of blinding explosions. The aftermath of the Extortion 17 catastrophe is difficult to summarize. Of the 38 occupants, 30 were Americans, so many that it would take the near basketball court-sized cargo holds of two separate C-17s to transport their remains back to the States. As you probably already know, 21 of these casualties were members of the US Navy, 4 of them being various specialists, 17 of them being Navy SEALs. 15 of those were assigned to Naval Special Warfare Development Group's Gold Squadron. Finding and informing that many families was a monumental undertaking for a single command. Kevin Houston's mother initially closed the door on the Keiko team, telling them, "Thanks for coming, but I really don't feel like doing this today," and then collapsed in her entryway. For funerals, there were so many scheduled and so close together that Dev Group had to employ a commercial jet just to shuttle its members around the country to attend them. At Arlington, and what I can best determine is the largest mass funeral there since the Vietnam War, 13 of the Extortion 17 men were buried, all in a single row, and an event so large that it required a nearby overflow auditorium that was itself overflowing with standing room only, and it had to be hastily connected to the main chapel by a suspended coax cable so impromptu that a passing tall truck was able to sever it mid-service. I suppose the low point for me that day was seeing the parents of Mission Commander Jonas Kelsall, a friend and SQT classmate. For me, his death was almost impossible to comprehend, since my thoughts that day kept turning to a time when he and I were co-conspirators in a preposterous scheme to upgrade our nosebleed Elton John tickets into front row seats. He can't defend himself now, so I can blame him for the whole episode, but I will add that it was Jonas who doubled down on the scheme's preposterousness by rushing the stage after Rocket Man to give Elton a high five. As this absurdity was competing with the unfolding reality of Jonas's parents' grief, another flashed before me when I heard from a teammate that Matt Mason's 2 young sons had just insisted on placing their lightsabers in their daddy's coffin. My most profound personal encounter with the Extortion 17 tragedy came at the funeral of my friend John Tummelson in Rockford, Iowa, a kind of single stoplight town whose turnout for the homecoming of their native son would have alone made the trip memorable. What made it unforgettable was a series of experiences. The impromptu honor guard that JT's teammates threw together to receive his remains, the overnight vigil that they kept so JT wouldn't be alone, and of course the image that made national news of JT's chocolate lab laying stubbornly at the foot of his coffin. My only issue with that scene was that I suspected it was a fraud, staged to suggest that JT hadn't been like all the other single dog owners in the teams, an absent father who shared custody with whichever sucker he could get to dog sit. The bigger story, if only the cameraman had just slightly shifted his attention to the right, would have been the 3 rows of gorgeous women in their mid-20s, all crying, and every one of them apparently under the same misconception that they had been JT's girlfriend. For as much as the aftermath of the Extortion 17 disaster left its shadow on everyone who encountered it, the experience of JT's funeral in particular, I can confidently say now 10 years on, was among the most personally consequential of my life. First of all, it was there that I met Jim Hornfisher, a literary agent responsible for books like Flags of My Fathers, but just as important, a naval historian who himself had written classics like The Last Stand of the Tin Can Sailors. There, as a guest of Marcus Luttrell, for whom he had been ghostwriting a book, Jim was nevertheless an unmissable 6'6" bespectacled outsider at the funeral and clearly in need of a drinking companion. A situation that our mutual friend solved by pouring 2 whiskeys, then introducing us as, in his words, the 2 biggest nerds he knew. It took about 30 seconds of conversation to realize I'd just been introduced to someone that would change my life. The second reason for this event's consequence in my life was that it was there that I first heard some of the details of the Extortion 17 mission and also got a preview of the many conspiracy theories that would surround it. For starters, as I've heard it variously described, the SEALs had been on their way to support or to come to the aid of or to rescue another unit, Task Force Red, otherwise known as Team Darby, a platoon of the 75th Ranger Regiment that had been attempting to capture or kill a Taliban warlord known as Qari Tahir, who himself had just risen to that position by filling a power vacuum created by American forces a few weeks earlier when they had killed his predecessor. As far as the conspiracies, the first I heard claimed that the RPG that struck the helicopter had turned after it was fired, suggesting it was actually a heat-seeking missile, and even further suggesting that the CIA was trying to save face by covering up the fact that they hadn't known about the existence of such weapons in that area. Another theory suggested that the Taliban had specifically laid a trap to lure SEAL Team 6 to the battlefield in order to avenge the killing of Osama bin Laden. Years later, a theory would race across social media suggesting that it was actually the American vice president himself who had sent SEAL Team 6 on this mission to cover up the fact that the bin Laden raid had been staged. Probably the most plausible conspiracy theory was one put forth in a ghost-written book by the inconsolable father of SEAL Aaron Vaughn, which wasn't really a conspiracy theory so much as just a lashing out at the rules of engagement set forth by planners adhering to a strategy of counterinsurgency. While being the eyewitness to several similar beer-soaked assertions made by teammates at JT's funeral, which I can only suppose ultimately spun themselves into this theory, I have to say I was and am more than a little skeptical. After all, if we were going to blame the disaster on something as broad as counterinsurgency's rules of engagement, then why not blame the even bigger entirety of America's war in Afghanistan? Both perfectly legitimate arguments. Not only did I not hear anyone at JT's funeral weekend raise this question, but just as importantly, neither did I hear anyone question the legitimacy of a Navy unit coming to the aid of Team Darby's Army Rangers. Even more remarkable, while in the physical presence of Jim Hornfisher, one of the country's preeminent naval historians, I also didn't hear anyone question the use of a Navy unit in the landlocked mountains of Afghanistan. The weirdest thing, the more that I thought about it, was that none of us even thought this was weird. As far as our experiences had taught us, the SEAL teams had about as much to do with the actual Navy as the post office, just another one of the delivery options available to us, and moreover, a branch of service that mostly resented us barely tolerated us, even used us as a recruitment tool to lure unwitting high schoolers away from Marine Corps recruiters and into buds where they would fail and thus ultimately be press ganged into the surface fleet. As far as we were concerned, our country's land wars were as much ours as they were the Army's or the Marine Corps'. And why wouldn't we think so? Within 3 months and 4 days, Navy SEALs had killed Osama bin Laden and suffered the US military's deadliest day in the war in Afghanistan, authoring both the War on Terror's greatest victory and now its largest single tragedy. And both events occurring more than 600 miles from the closest salt water. So why? Why had the Navy fielded one of the US military's most elite land-focused commando units? Considering the proliferation of all the other special operations units in the US military, units belonging to service branches that we'd all agree are the traditional tenets of its land operations, why did the Navy need to? Said another way, why on earth did the Navy create commandos that could raid anywhere on it? Jim Hornfisher's business card in my pocket, these were the questions that I set out to answer when I left JT's funeral in 2011. I never expected that they would dominate the next 10 years of my life, and more, that I would discover the answers that I did. If I had taken a wild stab at the beginning of this journey to question the reason that a Navy unit was found to be operating so far from the water, like everyone else, I probably would have guessed it was either just another example of quote unquote mission creep, in other words, that the SEALs mission over time had simply expanded inland, or it was just one of those accidental peculiarities that one has come to expect from a military apparatus that over the years has created 3 separate air forces, 2 separate navies and armies, one of the latter of which, the US Marine Corps, actually works for one of the navies. However, the more abstractly I thought about the contradiction of a Navy unit that specializes in what is clearly an Army or Marine Corps mission, a mission that is central to the existence of the SEAL teams, and I would even argue a mission that is its center of gravity, I could never have guessed that this contradiction had actually occurred, not in spite of the Army and Marine Corps, but because of them. The history that produced the rise of the Navy SEALs, a subtitle that I almost lost out to for my publisher's preference for the quote origin story of the Navy SEALs, but one I insisted on because it at least hinted that this rise had occurred in relation to other units, was a history that occurred over the course of 30 years, but as I will briefly show, is one that we don't even have to leave the Second World War to find the direction of its footprints. In 1942, the US Marine Corps created the Marine Corps Raiders, the country's first commando force, essentially because President Roosevelt wanted a gimmick that could boost the public's morale after the Pearl Harbor attack, but more importantly, because the US Marine Corps' parent service, the US Navy, wanted more vengeance than a decimated fleet could inflict, and because it wanted to spread out Japanese defenses with a series of submarine-launched raids across the Pacific. Totally preoccupied with the growth of their service to the size and status of the maritime equivalent of the US Army, the Marine Corps' leaders reluctantly obliged, but then entrusted the first of these missions not to one of their best officers, but to Evans Carlson, seen in the picture on the screen. He was a recently reactivated Marine officer who had previously left the Corps and his pension to write a series of books about China and himself, and whose selection had not at all been due to his leadership abilities, but really only to his personal connections to the president. The result was a 200-man raid on Macon Island that was almost a total disaster and led to an attempted surrender by Carlson and an alarmingly high casualty rate list of 18 dead plus 12 missing, presumably drowned. It was later learned that among those was Corporal James Gifford, an Apache Indian who had been left to die under a mesquite tree as a baby, but had been rescued and raised by a local shopkeeper. Having grown up with the knowledge of his own salvation from certain death, Gifford, after he had been rescued and taken to the submarine, had naturally volunteered to row back to Macon to rescue others, essentially to repay the kindness done to him. But it was a mission that ultimately, for him and the others, had ended in capture, imprisonment on Kwajalein, and death by beheading. Not long after the Macon Island debacle, the US Marine Corps disbanded its raiders, not because it wanted any less vengeance than the US Navy, but for its firm belief that nothing was more elite than a regular Marine, all of whom were at least as capable as anything Carlson had created, And because the Marine Corps finally upgraded its status to an equal ranking with its sister services, which meant it didn't have to take orders from the Navy anymore. It was a disbandment that did nothing to satisfy the Navy's original interest in using submarine-launched raids to thin out the Japanese defenses, or more importantly, in expanding the Navy's own share of combat contribution. In other words, its combat relevance. At the same time this was occurring, the U.S. Army, a branch of service unburdened by subordination to any other, least of all the U.S. Navy, likewise created its first commandos, the Army Rangers. In this case, the Army's leaders did this because they were responding to the president's interest, who wanted to match the more with less headline-making raids of the British commandos. For their part, the leaders of the U.S. Army, however, were less interested in making headlines than they were in creating a unit that could acquire the combat experience of the British commandos and then pass those lessons on to the rest of the Army. In other words, they wanted commandos in order to raise the level of the infantry and then spearhead for it. Unlike the experience of Carlson's raiders, however, the result was a series of remarkable behind-the-lines raids in North Africa and Sicily, victories due in no small part to their commander, William Orlando Darby. You can see right there. He was an incomparable combat leader, whose only fault seems to have been in his inability to say no, specifically no to a raid that was so big that it wasn't a raid at all. In this case, to seize the town of Cisterna in early 1944, a job so big that it should have been assigned to an infantry division and which led to the defeat and capture of 2 of Darby's entire Ranger battalions. It was the worst defeat in the history of American special operation. Shortly after this defeat, the Army disbanded half of its Ranger battalions because it blamed their defeats on tactical foul-ups instead of the flaws in their foundations, but also, like the Marine Corps, because the Army was still more preoccupied with standing up its infantry. An important preoccupation to note, since at that time, there was still only one branch of service that didn't have an infantry. The same branch that seemed to have lost none of its interest in expanding its own share of combat contribution. Between 1942 and 1945, the U.S. Navy, for the first time in its history, took center stage in the U.S. military's order of battle as an instrument of offensive warfare, an elevation due to the near universal barricading of its enemies behind moats as wide as oceans, but also an elevation due to the just as widespread aggressiveness of its leaders, not just in pulverizing their enemies' defenses, but in seizing their partners' responsibilities. Beach identification and marking from the Army, beach reconnaissance and underwater demolition from the Marine Corps. Most improbable of all, and almost completely forgotten by the general public today, guerrilla warfare in China from the OSS. 2 of these leaders are deserving of mention. The first was Draper Kaufman. He is in your upper right-hand screen. He was a Naval Academy graduate with eyes so bad that he was dropped from the Navy the day he received his diploma, but a man with so much drive that he went on to enlist in the French Army to drive an ambulance during the German invasion of 1940, then to enlist in the British Royal Navy's bomb disposal unit during the Blitz, then to create a course of instruction so tough that it enabled the U.S. Navy's demolitioneers to destroy the obstacles on Omaha Beach, then in the most pivotal battles of the Central Pacific, to prove the indispensability of the Navy's underwater demolition teams for the remainder of the war's invasions. The second leader was Robert Buckhaupin, who is lower center next to the Chinese officer. He was a former Lake Michigan sailboat racer and Jewish quarterback for the University of Notre Dame, who enlisted in the Navy as a seaman first class after Pearl Harbor, then as a member of the Army, Navy, Scouts, and Raiders, went on to mark the landing beaches for every major invasion in the European theater of operations, and went on to accomplish 2 of Naval Special Warfare's firsts. He was NSW's first scout to go ashore in North Africa, where he captured 2 Vichy French soldiers single-handedly, and later was NSW's first ground force commander, in which he spent the last 2 months of the war, much of it on horseback, leading Marines and sailors in hunting down the retreating Japanese army in China. Yes, I said the Japanese army, not the Japanese Navy. For a description of the organization to which Halpern belonged, here is a short excerpt from the book. By 1945, the Navy's Sino-American Cooperative Agreement, or SACO, had created a Navy-run guerrilla army and intelligence infrastructure that had stretched from Indochina to the Gobi Desert. Assisted by Marines, sailors had trained as many as 100,000 Chinese guerrillas. rescued airmen and missionaries, blasted open Japanese tanks, blown up some 158 bridges, derailed some 66 Japanese trains, sunk 35 Japanese ships, raided uncountable Japanese camps, and led at least one cavalry charge on camels. Best estimates of the time place the number of the Navy inflicted Japanese casualties at around 26,717 killed, 8,702 wounded, and 346 captured. Of the roughly 2,500 Marines and sailors that served in this Navy-run army, mostly sailors, however, only 5 were killed. In each of the Navy's arrangements with the unconventional units of its sister services in World War II, the Navy sailors like Kaufman and Halpern had arrived for apprenticeships and ended by holding the keys to the store. And in the case of the UDTs, had become so indispensable to the US Navy's mission that it was the only unconventional unit in World War II to survive disbandment, a fact which practically guaranteed that the Navy's frogmen soon saw themselves as the closest thing to commandos the US military had left. After World War II, and you'll have to get the book to get the rest of the story from the rest of the wars, the inland creep of naval special warfare continued to unfold in 2 separate strands, where it would intersect in Korea, then diverge again, and finally rebraid into one in Vietnam. The first strand was a process of repetition, in which the need for direct action raids, often launched from the sea, was identified by someone, usually in the Army or Marine Corps. Then a unit for this purpose was created and committed to action, often to disastrous results. Then that unit was either neglected, refocused, or disbanded altogether. The second strand was an even unlikelier process in which a series of Navy men, harnessing the latitude peculiar to their branch of service and ignoring the fact that they were often tacking into the winds of their sister services' prerogatives, drove their guns toward any gap in the line of battle into which they could squeeze their guns, even when they ran out of water on which to sail. The result was a culmination in the Mekong Delta, where the Navy's scout swimmers turned coastal raiders transformed themselves into go-anywhere capture-kill commandos and set an example for every other service branch's units to follow. It was an almost indescribably unlikely culmination, but one also deserving of an asterisk. On the day that I sat down at my kitchen table to start writing this book in 2013, I actually hesitated. Did the world really need another book about the SEAL teams? It was a fair question. There was no shortage of them, and there's even more now. The question's phrasing was one I pulled directly from the introduction to Bernard Cornwell's history on the Battle of Waterloo, a book that I had just read, and one of the most deserving battles in history for an overproduction of books, but one I was slightly self-conscious to ask myself on what is arguably an incidental unit. But try telling that to the publishing houses in New York. This was a fact I learned firsthand when I had fielded calls from various publishers who were interested in my book's proposal, and during which I found myself involuntarily wincing when one of them said that my contract would, quote, fill their quota for their SEAL book of the year. If that's still the case, it's no wonder then that the bookstores are awash in them. Books about SEALs, books by SEALs, and the categories are growing by the day. Leadership books, self-help books, exercise books, SEAL novels, SEAL biographies, SEAL memoirs masquerading as SEAL leadership and self-help books. Not to interrupt the flow, but I've always found these last categories confusing, since SEALs usually only have experience leading men that don't really need to be led and aren't generally known for helping anyone but themselves. If you disagree, I have an ex-wife who'd love to talk. Besides these, there is a growing trickle of books by SEALs running for political office, all of which make me instinctively pinch my shoulders above my ears, plus a handful of religious books, another handful aimed at kids, even a couple books about SEAL dogs. Apparently the last straw, because after the second of these, the Navy's leaders revoked the use of the trident on all publications till the end of time. Probably a long time coming. Though even I at the time couldn't have predicted this explosion in SEAL publications, I did obviously and eventually answer my own question as to whether or not the world needed another SEAL book, and for reasons that I will repurpose to now bring this talk to a close. The title for my book didn't come to me easily. When I had started, the name I gave my proposal was, quote, The Evolution. title meant to describe the drastic transformation that the Navy's special units had undergone, but it was also one that never sat well with me for several reasons. First, it was too big. How could I appropriate Darwin's term for the origins of the species to describe the transformation of so small a unit? Second, it also implied that this transformation had shared evolution's inevitability. Even before I moved on to researching my chapters on the Korean War, I knew that this transformation's most obvious feature was that it had been anything but inevitable. Each of the commando units I write about, the Raiders, the Rangers, the Devil's Brigaders, the Demolitioneers, the Jedburghs, the Frogmen, the Green Berets, the Lerps, the PRUs, the SEALs, had all had a creator or executioner who had had a specific purpose he was trying to solve or eliminate. George Marshall had created the Rangers because he wanted to raise the readiness of his infantry, then had permitted their disbandment because they'd been robbing from it. Kelly Turner had created the UDTs because he wanted his very own reconnaissance force, and the Navy had kept them around because they couldn't land anywhere without them. Bill Donovan and John McGee and Aaron Bank had all created a string of units because they were all trying to get themselves in a war, but the Army had funneled them into Bill Yarborough's special forces to outsource America's combat to others. The intent alone in these scenarios made it impossible for me to use a metaphor like evolution. Last and probably most important of all, I knew that that title wouldn't work because it suggested a process of natural selection or survival of the fittest, implying that the SEALs had come into being because I believed their creation, their survival, their preeminence was a result of their own superiority to other units and not the confluence of factors I've already described. In fact, when I finally had the whole book laid out before me, I knew probably better than anyone alive that the SEALs' creation and survival had not been entirely due to their best traits, just like the Rangers' various disbandments had not been entirely due to their worst. So now what? The real problem with my title dilemma was that I couldn't think of a replacement. Not for years. I always thought that I would stumble upon a good quote or fall for a turn of phrase, but I never did. A slightly terrifying and specific form of writer's block that I simply couldn't find my way out of. Even after a series of long runs, the best cure I'd ever found for beating a confession out of my brain. As was usually the way out of this nightmare, the solution came only when I found the courage to confront the blinking cursor and the blank page and ask myself the hardest of all questions. What at its core was this book about? The answer, as I discovered, would end up performing double duty for solving both my problems. Though it had always been my objective to explain the creation of a unit that should never have existed, but was essentially an underdog story, I had somehow managed to overlook the fact that nearly all the stories that had supported mine were every bit as longshot. Once I had made this realization, it was only a matter of ransacking Google for a story that could act as the right metaphor. In the end, a longshot led by Justinian II, the deposed Byzantine emperor who led a small group of seafaring raiders across the Black Sea and through an unguarded aqueduct to capture the uncapturable city of Constantinople, essentially a victory won by water beneath the walls. What better way to describe a book that was essentially a series of underdog stories? Small unit raids and recons, most of them outnumbered, all of them behind enemy lines, many of them undertaken by intermingled units of soldiers and sailors, Marines and frogmen. The most consequential being those in which these groups were forced to risk everything to accomplish their missions or to save each other. The beach marking missions in North Africa by Army Scouts and Navy boat crews. The backdoor reconnaissance of Tinian by VAC Recon Marines and UDT swimmers. The destruction of Hitler's Atlantic Wall by Army engineers and NCDUs. The blowing up of North Korean railroads by Marines, Rangers, Frogmen, and British commandos. The beach assault at the Bay of Pigs by Special Forces trained CIA operatives and UDT trained Cuban volunteers, all the way to the failed rescue of an American POW by SEAL Team 2 7th Platoon and the Army's 9th Infantry Division, Lerps. Because the history of the Navy's unconventional units from the Second World War to the war in Vietnam are so intertwined with those of their sister units, and because without those sister units, the SEALs would absolutely not exist, and because none of these stories is essentially different in character from the Gold Squadron SEALs of Extortion 17 that had raced to the aid of Team Darby's Army Rangers, Rangers who'd literally been named for the commander whose defeat at Cisterna in 1944 had opened the way for Navy commandos in the first place, then the answer to the question I posed before writing this book is clear. yes, we absolutely need another book about the SEAL teams, if for no other reason than this. The history of the Navy's fostering of its SEALs as a land-focused direct action commando force is not just SEAL history. It's a lens by which we can view the entire history of the US military's whipsawing interest in direct action and commando units. In other words, it's the origin story of American special operations. And I would even take this one step further. You'll never understand why the Navy's sailor commandos came to be selected to go to Abbottabad in 2011, unless you first understand why the Marine Corps' Raiders came to be disbanded after they were chased off Macon Island in 1942. Or unless you understand why a dozen other American units between the Second World War and the war in Vietnam came to have the rugs pulled out from under them, only to watch their legacies and lessons funnel into the one before us now. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Laura.
Thanks so much, Ben. Well, just as a reminder, we have about the last kind of 10-15 minutes here to go through questions. I'll get through as many as I possibly can in the time allotted. But I wanted to start off with a question for you that I had come in. And Ben, can you tell us a little bit more about how your personal experiences as a Navy SEAL impacted your time writing this book?
Sure. I mean, this is a question that I had even before I joined the Navy. It wasn't one that I really came back to until the extortion 1-7 funerals, but it was something that, I mean, I didn't understand the reason for it. When I was a young man, kind of shopping around in the market to join the military, I wanted to have a commando type experience, like a lot of other young men, and I was concerned that I was joining the Navy, and I didn't really understand why the Navy had this, you know, this unit called the SEALs, and that SEALs went everywhere. It didn't make any sense to me. And then when I got into the SEAL teams, I was just as equally confused. I found myself in the middle of Iraq, you know, completely disassociated with the water, except for the Euphrates River that we would occasionally use to transit up and insert from boats. But other than that, we were almost completely divorced from the water. So I guess that was just a question that I never understood the answer to.
Yeah. All right, so I have our next question coming in from a guest, and they mentioned that in the 1980s, as a midshipman, they were given the amazing opportunity to attend what was then called, and I apologize if I get this wrong, called mini BUDs.
Mini buds.
Thank you. Infantry girl here. A 3-week SEAL indoctrination. At the time, the teams were quite small. Do you think the rapid growth of special ops after 9/11 is a statement on the future of American warfighting?
Absolutely. You want a longer answer?
Only if you want to provide one.
No, I mean, the asker's right. I mean, we have a very complicated set of problems, I think, that we're dealing with, and when you have complicated sets of problems like these, you're going to naturally rely on the folks in the U.S. military that have been best prepared to operate in environments that are not necessarily clear, that are oftentimes surrounded. If you go back to one of the most interesting chapters for me to write was my chapter about the Army Special Forces just prior to the Vietnam War. And President Kennedy had kind of latched on to the Green Berets as this do anything force that could mobilize the Third World against communism. If not turn them into soldiers, if not turn these Third World tribesmen into soldiers, then at least deny them to the communists. And it really, I mean, you watch, if you read the book, you'll see, you know, story after story after story of these Green Berets in longer and longer shot little operations or little outposts in which they are forced to, you know, advocate or defend American foreign policy on a shoestring. And I think we're going to see a lot of that happening over the next couple of years as we try and get our footing under us after what's going on right now.
Excellent. And I just want to let you know we have some comments coming in that are just thanking you for a wonderful presentation and an engaging presentation. So I want to let you know that those are coming in as well. This is a really great question. What does SEAL stand for? Is it an acronym?
It is. It's an acronym for Sea, Air, and Land.
Excellent. All right. And we touched a little bit about that one. So this guest has a question about a specific veteran. His name is William Hopper, better known as Paul Drake. He was a Navy frogman during World War II, and it has been said that his hair went premature white because of his hazardous top secret missions he went on. Are you familiar with this veteran's story or any of these top secret missions?
No, I'm not, but I mean, the frogmen of World War II were exposed to some pretty harrowing conditions. Chapter 5 in the book was one of the harder chapters I had to write, which deals with the UDT experience just in the Central Pacific. And the reason it was such a hard chapter to write was because I probably collected more material on that group than any other that I wrote about, and it was I had more than I could possibly go through. But there were so many teams that were created because they were so indispensable to the amphibious fleet that they all produced lengthy after action reports and lengthy team histories. And these team histories are fascinating. What these guys actually went through, and the sense of humor that they were able to retain during their campaigns, particularly that last campaign in Okinawa. That campaign for the UDTs was particularly daunting. Not only were they having to contend with the typical waves and cold and machine gun fire and mortar blasts and just the oil in the waters and the flames on top of the water sometimes, but they were having to deal with a persistent threat of kamikaze attack. So very rarely were these guys sleeping. When they weren't in the water, they were setting or preparing their demolitions for their next mission. And if they weren't doing that, then they were manning ships' guns to prevent getting blown up in the water by a Japanese kamikaze. So it wouldn't surprise me if that story is true.
All right. So we had just talked about what the acronym of SEAL stands for, so sea, air, land. Do you ever think that maybe that might creep into space?
Oh, I don't know.
It's something to think about.
One fortunate thing about being a quasi-historian is that I don't have to think about the future. If they do edge in that direction, then I'll write about it 20 years after the fact.
I'm looking forward to that book. We'll host you for come back for that Date with History, and
we're going to look a lot different.
So different. So during the Vietnam War, can you expand on what were some of the responsibilities that SEALs had performed and how those roles have changed in comparison Vietnam to World War II?
Sure. When Vietnam starts, the SEAL teams are only about 4 years old. When the first SEAL platoons are sent to Vietnam, they're only about 4. So they're in their infancy, and they're created in 1962. Sort of as the Navy's utility force, but with an idea that they're going to be coastal raiders. So they spend their first 4 years of preparation thinking about how they could land on an enemy shore, sneak ashore, and blow up an enemy command post, an enemy radar station, a train, something like that. Something similar to the experience that the UDT frogmen and the CIA operatives had accomplished in the Korean War. So they're sort of a prisoner to the history of the last war, like we always are. But when we get to Vietnam, the SEALs that get there, they are assigned to a tidewater, a backwater of the war, just south and east of Saigon. And there are no command posts. There are no radar dishes. There's nothing. There's barely any munitions depots or anything like that. There's nothing but swampland, but this swampland keep producing rocket attacks on Saigon, and they don't know where to go. They don't know who to attack. There's no intelligence to tell them where most of these enemy fighters are. And the first commander of that detachment, he essentially throws up his hands and says, "This war isn't for us. We have nothing to do here." And he shacks up with a nurse in Saigon. All the rest of the guys in the detachment, they start doing the same thing. And the Navy's commanders in theater get so frustrated with the SEALs, they're ready to send them home. They have no reason to have a unit that's not going to at least try and get into the fight. And if it's not for one enterprising, or not enterprising, but one steadfast Phil Bucklew, who was one of the first members of Naval Special Warfare to go ashore and then to lead guerrillas in China. If he hadn't been in a leadership role at that point in history, then the SEAL teams probably wouldn't be the SEAL teams. But an enterprising, they sent one of their best young enterprising officers to take over the detachment, one Lieutenant Maynard Wires, and he basically tells his guys, "This is the only war in town, so we're not leaving." And they start figuring it out, and they essentially transition themselves, or they transform themselves from sort of unemployed coastal raiders into intelligence-driven capture kill commandos. It takes a while, but by 1968, by the end of by mid 1968, the transformation is almost complete, and they have they've become this new thing that nobody else in the U.S. military at that time had achieved. So they are the first. The SEALs become the first permanent land-focused commandos in the U.S. military's inventory.
All right. I want to make sure I get this one correct. So give me a second. I'm going to get a little closer to my screen, make sure I'm reading it correctly and everything. So in chapter 7, you talk about Lieutenant Clark and his efforts in Korea off the West Coast. How did you come across the details of his efforts on Yeonghong-do? Specifically, you mentioned getting information from a non-published memoir from his daughter. Can you comment on this? And did you get a lot of the information for your book from descendants of your subjects?
Yeah, Clark's account. So everybody knew about Clark's account, or Clark's mission at the time. His story was written about, highlighted in every major Navy-produced history that was written, the contemporary history that was written within 3 or 4 years of the Korean War happening. For whatever reason, and likely because it was a CIA-sponsored raid, or CIA-sponsored reconnaissance, the CIA probably has those records still kept to themselves. And of all the places, of all the institutions that I researched this book, the National Archives, the Marine Archives at Quantico, the Navy Archives at the Navy Yard, and the Carlisle Archives, or the Army's Archives in Carlisle. Those are the main institutions I went to, plus the UDT SEAL Museum and a couple of others. But the worst institution to deal with is the CIA. It's a black hole of information. So a lot of the official reports on that, on Clark's mission to Yeonghong-do are still not available. So a lot of the record comes from his own personal account, which he never tries to publish, and he writes, I would say 15 years after the fact, when he gets a Pentagon assignment, and he just starts clacking this thing out on a typewriter. And it comports with everything that was written by historians at the time, and the fact that he doesn't even attempt to publish it is seems to me another indicator of its veracity. Plus, he doesn't even mention the additional raids that the Navy sends him on after that first mission off of Incheon. But yes, absolutely. I spoke to Clark's daughter several times. I talked to his son-in-law. I've talked to other folks that knew him, and just about every main character that I talk about in the book, I made a significant attempt to contact a family member to track down any letters that they had written, anything contemporaneous, and made just great friends in the process. One of the best parts of writing this book was just the fact of just meeting the people that I got to meet. So.
Do SEAL teams and the Rangers work together on missions ever?
All the time. In fact, because of the SEAL teams literally wouldn't exist without the influence of Ranger School. So after the Korean War, the Rangers are, they're disbanded. The only thing that exists of the Ranger experience is the Ranger School, which is sort of why George Marshall had created them in the first place. He wanted a school that would be able, it was sort of like a graduate level course in infantry tactics. So the Ranger School still exists. And one of the first things that the SEALs do when they're created is they send as many guys, as many of the new SEALs as they can through Army Ranger School. And in the process of going through Army Ranger School, they learn one significantly valuable lesson, which is the 5-paragraph order. That 5-paragraph order is essentially a very hasty way to plan any sort of operation, but specifically raids. So if it had not been for the Ranger experience in World War II, the SEALs would not have been able to get all those lessons at Ranger School in the early 1960s. It's just funny that all of those lessons, no one had ever anticipated that it was going to be a Navy unit that was ultimately the descendant that was going to pick up all those lessons. It's not until 1974, after the Vietnam War, that the Army decides we should never have gotten rid of the Rangers, reconstitute them, and they essentially become the Army's commandos. They're distinct from the Army Special Forces, which they will do commando type raids, but their center of gravity is that they are by, with, and through, that they are always trying to mobilize locals, lead locals. They're a force multiplier, whereas the Army's Rangers are straight commandos, which is when it comes to genealogy, is probably much closer to the SEAL experience than the Green Berets. So yes, the Army Rangers and the SEALs have a lot in common.
You'd mentioned the CIA. How much did you personally interface with the CIA?
Not much. I mean, I would send emails, and they would get not responded to, or if they did get responded to, they would lead to mostly nowhere. Found quite a few documents in other sources that were CIA documents, or in other places that would have joint relevance for Army units and Navy units. So I find those at the National Archives.
So given your decade of research and perspective as an operator, do you find yourself wishing that the mission set had been more focused, or upon reflection, is the diverse skill set and wide strategic aperture birthed by history a strength? This is from your friend, by the way, Josh.
Josh? That's a mouthful. I think it's a strength. I mean, I think the one advantage that I think the SEALs had or relied on at the beginning was they were willing to talk to everybody. And one thing that I've noticed about the SEAL teams since then, or since the early days, is they've become much more insulated. The SEALs are very confident in their own abilities, just like I was at the time. And we tend to think that if it's our method, it's probably the best method. One thing that I found in researching this book is the SEALs' success often came from their ability to push into areas that they weren't necessarily comfortable in, but also to learn from others and to take the best practices of other units. So absolutely, I think the SEALs generality or focus on being generalists, not necessarily specialists or maritime specialists. I think that's absolutely a credit to themselves, or a credit to the institution.
All right, so I've had a couple of guests ask very similar minded questions. I'm going to try and wrap these all up into one for you. So as the 20-year war is beginning to kind of wrap up and we're closing that, what do you feel is maybe the future of the SEALs post this? And do you feel that they might have a role in Afghanistan in the future, perhaps? And this is, again, opinions.
I don't know. Like I said before, one advantage that I have in being a writer that focuses on history is that I don't have to ask or answer questions about the future. I know that's a cop-out, but I would say that we can't predict what's going to happen. I mean, whenever the drawdown period of any war is going to bring challenges, and challenges, some of them that you're going to anticipate, but most of them that you're not. And a lot of this is going to be decided by politicians, what they want the U.S. National security infrastructure to look like, or what they want our objectives to be. We don't have a system that necessarily assigns a strategic objective and then backfills that objective with resources. We have sort of a dual part system where you have strategic objectives, sometimes you don't, but you also have a system that's just going to man and equip the way that we've been manning and equipping, sort of waiting for these two to sort of intersect. I think we're probably better than we were after World War II. I think we have gotten away from the idea that you can complete a conflict and then totally retract back down to sort of an isolationist type military where we don't want to be or have an influence overseas. I think we've gotten away from that, and I think that's for the good. The SEALs are going to respond as expected. SEALs are not going to be satisfied with any sort of role that isn't at the center of whatever that mission ultimately becomes. And if that mission becomes, Space Marines or some sort of cyber role, then SEALs are going to adapt into that environment, as will Rangers or any other institution that has a bias toward action. So, and there's no other institution that is more, aggressive or willing to adapt than Naval Special Warfare.
Thanks. So we're going to start wrapping up questions. So I just have just letting our guests know. So Ben, I have one more question for you and then one more comment. And I do want to say thank you again to all of our guests who have been sharing their thanks to you, Ben, for your content and are looking forward to reading the books. I just want to pass those forward to you. Thank you for those comments, everybody. Understanding and respecting that this was such a significant undertaking and spanning 10 years of time. If you could rewind back time, would you do it again?
I don't know. It was, I mean, yeah, the book changed my life. I mean, it was, I absolutely, I would do it again. I need a break. I need a vacation right now. The publisher, when I signed the contract for the book, the publisher gave me 2 years to write this thing. I took 8. So it took 8 years to go all the way from signing the contract to actually publishing it. And then there was another 2 years on the front end of this, of just researching and reading more casually, but still trying to figure out what the hell this book was going to even be about. But yeah, I would do it again. I would, if I had this to do over again, I would probably try and come up with a topic a little bit narrower in focus. I didn't, when I set out to do this thing, I'd established an endpoint. I knew that I wanted to, right to the point where I knew the SEAL teams had become the SEAL teams that I knew. I knew from my own experience what the SEAL teams were. They were a go anywhere, capture, kill force. I knew that had happened in Vietnam. I just didn't know where to start. I suspected that the Navy's interest in sort of coastal raiders or commandos probably happened in World War II. So I sort of started my research around that area, stumbled upon the Makin Island raid, and it was, the Makin Island raid was exactly, it sets the whole book. And then once I had those two, endpoints established, even though I knew it was 30 years, and even though I knew it was, a daunting task, 30 years of history, I knew I had to do it, and I couldn't not do it. Unfortunately, I had that, the same obsession that got me through Buds got me through this. So.
Well, again, Ben, I want to thank you so much for spending your time with our audience tonight and sharing the story of your book. I'm sure that has whet everybody's appetite. I'm sure they're really excited to go and learn even more than what you shared tonight in the book. And just as a reminder to everybody, if you would like to get a signed copy of Ben's book, you're absolutely able to do that. Get yourself to Cantini on Sunday, September 19th. It is on our events calendar. So if you don't remember, don't worry, head over to our events calendar. It's there. Between 11:30 and 12:30, Ben will be at the Visitor Center here at Cantini Park, the Visitor Center, not First Division Museum, the Visitor Center, to sign copies of his books. And Ben, we're looking forward to seeing you then. Thank you so much, everybody. We'll see you in October for our next Date with History. Everybody have a wonderful evening. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Ben.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, guys.